Panelists are already lined up, so let's convene tonight's summit. And this evening, joining us from Chicago, a senior advisor of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Mr. Richard Goldberg, defense and government analyst and commentator Amir Oren, and Middle East analyst Nathaniel Shuraki. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for joining us today. As our main topic, clear nuclear, just 6% away from getting the bomb as the Iran nuclear deal dead. Let's take a closer look and pick up the conversation from there.
Iran's nuclear program has stepped up rapidly in the last year, and it could be ready very soon. Inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency have reportedly stated that uranium from Iranian nuclear sites has reached 84% purity, almost at the 90% purity needed for nuclear weapons. Ever since the United States left the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, Iran has sped up its nuclear program, with IAEA head Rafael Grossi saying earlier this year that Iran already had the potential for several nuclear weapons. So, is a nuclear Iran going to come sooner than anticipated? And if it does, is there a real concern that it will use nuclear weapons, or is this merely fear-mongering? Should the West try and re-enter negotiations for the sake of nuclear control, even if it means a compromise? What's next for Iran's nuclear program?
So let's get to it. What's next for Iran's nuclear program? As always, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. So, Mr. Goldberg, please take the lead.
Sure. I think what Iran is telling us is that they are already technically at the nuclear threshold state capacity. Whether they intended to or not, they're obviously undertaking the technical means to produce weapons-grade uranium. They are capable of producing weapons-grade uranium. Whether they're producing 84% or 90% is rather immaterial, obviously, unless they are going to use that material to make a nuclear bomb. So our policy should consider them at the threshold. We need to abandon the nuclear deal framework, return to a pressure and deter strategy immediately.
Okay, Amir Oren, your thoughts?
Your report stated that Iran has sped towards the bomb since Trump revoked the American side of the deal. Let me take issue with this word. It did not really speed. Actually, it is inching. In 5 years, it is only crawling towards the threshold, and it doesn't really want to be part of the Russian-Chinese axis to which it is now being drawn because of Ukraine.
Okay, last but not least, Nathaniel Shuraki, your take?
Yes, I want to circle back to the main issue here that has been presented as entirely factual. We don't know yet what these 84% are. It's for certain that they have been measured, but both the initial report from Bloomberg and the IAEA and Iran say that this could be an intentional accumulation of fissile material in the centrifuges. That doesn't change anything about Iran's actual intentions, but whether this threshold was crossed is of primary importance to today's debate. So we have to wait to know more, and this is what the US and their allies are trying to do before we outline the different scenarios.
Okay, and let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards, gentlemen. Mr. Goldberg, I do want to begin with you. Can Biden really afford to give up on the nuclear deal?
I think he can, because politically it's completely insane for him to continue to pursue the nuclear deal. When you have people in the streets in Iran throughout the country, we just saw again Thursday night people coming to the streets when people thought the protests were dead, and they say, please don't give money to this regime. We hate this regime. This is not our government. When you see Iran providing weapons to Russia to kill Ukrainians, when there are terror plots on U.S. soil, UK soil, European soil, it's very easy to say, let's not do this deal anymore. Let's not lift sanctions. Let's return to a policy of pressure on this regime and military deterrence to deny them the pursuit of nuclear weapons.
So Amir, should the U.S. really revisit to an extent the maximum pressure policy?
No, not to my mind. Neither the maximum pressure campaign of Trump and Pompeo nor the withdrawal from the JCPOA have helped the West, Israel, the United States, hold off Iran. Actually, Iran got closer because of the actions by Netanyahu and Trump. Diplomacy is always better than war.
But should, or rather can, the nuclear talking point be separated from other Iran-related talking points, Netanel Shraki?
Well, actually, that's what you see right now. It's not that they're separated; it's that they obscure it. The reason why the West, the EU, and America doesn't seem to be so interested, to be honest, in the Iran nuclear issue is because they are focused on other issues. They don't link them. They are focused on retaliating against Iran for providing nuclear weapons, not nuclear weapons, just regular weapons. Bad
just
enough.
Regular, yeah.
Just regular for now. That's already bad enough against Ukrainians to Russia. They already instated some sanctions because of the protests and human rights violations. And these seems to be the two main things on the Iran agenda from the West. So in fact, they kind of create a kind of mutually profitable status quo because the West doesn't have bandwidth to deal with that right now, and Iran doesn't want the West to deal with this right now. So they don't connect. They actually separate the two issues, and that's very problematic because the status quo, I mean, there's something worse than the status quo, of course, but status quo is not something that we should be aiming for right now, because that means that the IAEA keeps being unable to have full oversight over what's going on. We know, we've been knowing that from it's a year. The cameras have been blind. Some of them have been blind. Access to enrichment facilities have been restricted. So the status quo is not satisfactory, and it is a direct result of things going on in other parts of the world.
But Richard Goldberg, is the U.S. perhaps sending mixed signals here, and by that hindering any resolution? On the one hand, saying all options are on the table, obviously alluding to military action, at the same time saying we're not shutting the door diplomacy. So maybe again, it is simply sending too many opposing signals here.
There's completely mixed signals coming from the administration. And if you're sitting in Tehran, you don't believe the United States will stop you from pursuing a nuclear weapon today, because they've pursued over 2 years of a maximum deference policy. Remember, much of the advancement in Iran's nuclear program is not under Trump and Pompeo, as your last guest said. It was under Biden when he pulled back on the maximum pressure campaign. That's when we saw 20%, and then we saw 60%, and then we saw now the race all the way up towards weapons grade. And every time Iran inches closer to the red line, what they thought was the red line, they're surprised to see there's no major pushback from the West. So of course they continue to move forward slowly. It's not a breakout, it's a walkout. And so until we understand that you can't go back to the old nuclear deal, it doesn't work anymore. The sunset provisions are already expiring. The technical restrictions on Iran have already been blown through by the Iranians. You can't go back to it. You would essentially be paying Iran to sit on the nuclear threshold and use its money to sponsor terrorism and missiles against you. That is not an option. That's a fantasy. Let's live in the real world where you have to pressure the regime to squeeze its resources of terrorism and use military deterrence and the potential use of military force to stop its nuclear weapons program.
Amir Oren, Richard Goldberg saying, reality calling. Are you answering?
So the global context is completely different now than it was 8 years ago when the deal was struck, because China and Russia at that time were united in the same front, on the same wavelength with the United States and the European powers. Now they are not, of course. And Iran can get money and political support by selling drones to Russia and actually giving them the knowledge to produce drones over there. So the United States doesn't have such a tight control over the Iranian budget. And it turns out that the EU has not lost hope and is still trying to mediate between the Americans and the Iranians.
They haven't lost hope, but they definitely lost interest. But it is true, if I may interject here, that however dried up we may think that the Iranian economy might be and the Iranian funding for the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, might be, it doesn't affect their capacity to strike outside of Iran, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria in particular, and in Iraq. In fact, the more dried up they seem to be, the more aggressive they are externally. So the maximum pressure strategy, which I'm not saying there is a better option right now, but thinking that it will curb Iran's sponsorship of terrorism is, I believe, a mistake that even in the previous situation where there wasn't such a close collaboration with Russia through Ukraine, even in that situation didn't even work.
Richard Goldberg, I can see that you're not in full agreement.
Well, no, it's revisionist history on the financials of the regime under maximum pressure and then under maximum deference. Remember, we came into the Biden administration in 2021. The IMF told us Iran was down to $4 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Had we continued maximum pressure, we don't know what would have happened to that regime. What did happen was the Biden administration pulled back on maximum pressure, actually waived sanctions, gave Iran access to some of its oil revenues, and then we saw oil prices rise with no crackdown on the illicit oil trade with China. What has happened now is the opportunity, if we actually snap back, we are seeing today, because of the increasing isolation from Europe, from the UK and the United States, because of their drone supply to Russia, because of the repression at home, there is enormous stress in the system. We're seeing them pump money to try to keep that rial up as much as they can while it continues to go down. They're burning reserves to prop up the currency. If you were to snap back UN sanctions and end the deal, make it clear to the market there will be no Iran nuclear deal, you will finally basically have that last little piece on the camel's back there for the Iranian economy. So maximum pressure did work. It can work. All of that, of course, has to come with military deterrence to stop the nuclear threat.
Ellie, if I may interject.
Please.
Firstly, I'd like to know where one can sign on for the Pompeo for President campaign, one of whose lines we just heard. Incidentally, I'm not saying that Mr. Goldberg is rooting for Pompeo, but this seems to be Pompeo's excuse for the failure of the maximum pressure campaign. But also, what we hear in this debate is the echo of the old Soviet debate in the 1970s on whether one can should separate the nuclear file from human rights and other issues. And the answer was yes. Nuclear is existential. All the other issues are very important, but let's deal with that first.
Nathaniel Shiraki?
That is a misappropriation of history because Ronald Reagan dealt with the Soviets on arms control. That was true arms control. What sort of deployments of U.S. missiles would there be in correspondence to Soviet missiles? We weren't paying the Soviets billions of dollars to put their missiles down. That's not what arms control was, and that's not what this is. This is appeasement of actually paying money to a regime to hurt you with it, just to not hurt you today with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, hurt me tomorrow, just spare me the day. On that note, we are taking a very short break, but when we get back, we continue our conversation, of course, so hold your thoughts right there. Richard Goldberg, Amir Orr, and Nathaniel Shiraki, you are staying with us. A few minutes break, and we're back with part 2 of the summit. Don't go anywhere.
If you could travel to the Middle East right now without packing and without a plane ticket, would you? We are in Tel Aviv, Israel. Welcome to i24 News Digital. Here, we bring Israel and the entire Middle East right to your social networks. On your phone, on your desktop. Here, i24 News creates videos especially made for social media. And believe me, we are out there working hard.
Right here.
Israel and Nepal.
For the very first time.
Is how they begin. Making original content. Streaming live, even in the hard moments.
There are literally rockets going off. I'm in a bomb shelter.
And filming docuseries. With us, you will find all the big stories you missed on television. So join i24 News on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and discover the Middle East with us.
Я один раз сюди приходила свого котика тут шукати. Хотіла його покормити і побачила тут інших котиків. Мені їх стало шкода.
This week, in Mallard at Large, my guest will be Pierre Vimont, former ambassador in the US, former number 2 of European diplomacy, and Emmanuel Macron's special emissary to Russia.
If there were to be a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran, Israel's allies would remain very firm and show their support in every way possible.
Mallard at Large with Christian Mallard this week on i24 News.
Sometimes it's tough to get past all the noise and get to the heart of the story. Even tougher to make sense of it all. And that's where we come in. I'm David Matlin, and each weekday I'll take on the most important topics, breaking down the issues so you can decide for yourself. Zoom in each weekday here at i24 News.
Strictly Security, your weekly look into security, intelligence, and strategic affairs. Our team brings the latest on the major international conflicts, analysis of the major security issues right here in the Middle East and around the globe. Saturdays, only on i24 News.
We're on the inside of political and religious passions in Jerusalem, breaking down the financial trends shaping the global economy, giving you key context, not just headlines, with the stories from Israel that touch the U.S. and those across the region with impact far beyond its borders. Catch the rundown where the Middle East meets the world.
Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Nathaniel Shiraki, Middle East analyst, defense and government commentator Amir Oren, and senior advisor of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Richard Goldberg. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, but before we get back to our conversation, early this month, a landmark visit by Iranian President Raisi, receiving really a red carpet welcome in Beijing by China's President Xi Jinping. A visit closely watched, naturally, in Washington. Let's take a listen.
PRC has a role to play in very clearly signaling to Iran that its destabilizing activities, that its brinksmanship is not going to be rewarded, it's not going to be countenanced, it is not something that the international community is prepared to sit idly by and watch. Now, I would need to refer you to the PRC regarding any messages that they may have conveyed in that direction or otherwise, but it's our hope that on this challenge, the PRC will use its influence in a direction that would be in both of our interests.
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Is the alternative for a deal with Iran war? Let's once again begin with our quick fire round and pick it up from there. Amir Oren, please take the lead.
So the Iranians are, of course, always worried about their regime survival, and they would like to get protection from any other power, by any other power, but they don't want to be dependent on either Moscow or Beijing. So they're trying to play each part of this triangle against the other two. Whether they succeed or not, we'll see down the road.
Nathaniel Shiraki, your thoughts?
Well, I just read a piece by John Bolton that says that the alternative to the deal would be Iran's people. That's what he wrote, and he said to your colleagues of Arab News. That's a fantasy of the EU, of the US. It's been a while, that the regime change fantasy, that these protests would eventually bring the regime down. I'm not saying it might, it's not going to happen. It might, but counting on this is extremely dangerous, and supporting this in that direction can backfire in so many ways. So the two options are military intervention or another deal. And I'm not saying war. Military intervention can be fairly discreet.
Yes, last but not least, Richard Goldberg, your take?
I think the alternative is fairly simple. It's pressure and deter. Pressure means we make sure that we use all of the tools that we have, economic, covert, political isolation, to squeeze this regime of its resources so it cannot sponsor terrorism and do other malign activities. Deter is we decouple that from the nuclear program and make clear we are willing to use force to stop their pursuit of nuclear weapons, and we may have to do so.
And let's feel free to interact once again, gentlemen, and engage in a conversation. So perhaps, just perhaps, instead of trying to prevent it, should the West simply get used to the notion of a nuclear Iran and get prepared to a world in which Iran is nuclear?
Well, that would be a very different world.
Because...
Please.
Go ahead.
No, please, after you.
Amir, take the lead.
It won't happen because obviously following Iran would be Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt and the UAE. So, and Iran knows it full well. Perhaps what it really wants is to stay at or near the threshold and convert its ability to break out and get something for it, be it some protection for the regime or money or any other thing that they might want, provided that Khamenei is still there. If there's a succession, we don't know what the decision-making process in Tehran is going to be.
Nathaniel Shiraki, please.
Well, I wish I had your hopes. I agree with your analysis that a nuclear Iran would mean a nuclear Saudi Arabia, potentially a nuclear Turkey, and potentially even, as you said, a nuclear Egypt. But I disagree with your hopeful take on the fact that this is the reason why it's not going to happen. I don't think that nuclear proliferation in the Middle East is something that Iran is so sensitive about. They just want to be the first ones to have it. So I actually have a question for my fellow two panelists, and especially for Mr. Goldberg. I'm not convinced at all by the pressure strategy. I really think that's not going to work. They already have enough material to build several weapons. Not me that says it's grossly from the IAEA. It's just not enriched enough. But they have the material. So if you cut them funding, they still have the material and the capacity to enrich it. So the pressure strategy doesn't seem to be working for me. Now, what you said that convinced me a little more would be actually more of a military threat. But I don't see both going together, and I see a little bit of discrepancy in this proposal of yours.
Mr. Goldberg.
Yeah, I agree with my panelists on their talk about the proliferation concerns of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East that we cannot afford. But I also am struck by how self-deterred we are already when Iran does not have nuclear weapons. And we are sitting around beating ourselves up over whether or not we should even have a military bottom line and be willing to use it right now to take out their nuclear program. Can you imagine what that conversation would be like with a nuclear-armed Iran? Only a nuclear-armed Iran that has its will with cruise missile attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure, or vessels in the Gulf or in the Red Sea. People didn't really like how the Russia-Ukraine war was going for energy prices. Get ready for a nuclear-armed Iran. So obviously, we have a responsibility to take action now before Iran is armed with a nuclear weapon. And to go back to the other panelist's question, to me, I would just say you do decouple it, because in the end, pressure on this regime, containing this regime within its borders, needs to be a national security priority. What we've actually done is got lost. We've taken the bait and put the nuclear issue in place of all of the different malign activities of the regime. It is better for U.S. national security and Israeli national security and pretty much the world's national security for Iran to have less money than more money. We know that's true. So sanctions need to stay in place, and we need to enforce them. But the nuclear piece is not going to be solved by sanctions alone. It will only be solved ultimately if the regime in Tehran believes we are willing to use force, and if necessary, we do use force to stop it.
So Mr. Goldberg is saying, look at us tiptoeing now. What happens once Iran gets nuclear, Amir Oren?
So for very obvious reasons, you may call it realistically, politically, domestically, wars of choice are a thing of the past. Now, Mr. Goldberg may be right that the need is there, but you're only able to convince your domestic audience, the electorate, once it happens.
It's too late?
Well, it will not be too late, because they will not have the nuclear warheads on the missiles ready for launch. Obviously, if they break out, if they have a nuclear test or a similar demonstration of nuclear capability, Israel will strike, even if Israel has to strike alone.
And as we're nearing the end of our discussion, Nathaniel Shiraki, considering Iran's multiple violations and the lack of action, did the international community mechanism turn out to be an empty shell when it comes to the Iranian question?
That's interesting, because that's exactly an empty shell. And that might be the reason why it can't die, because an empty shell can survive for a while. It actually serves as a placeholder. It's only empty, as you said, but it's still there to avoid something worse. That's we call in international relations an international institution. An institution doesn't necessarily need to have some content. It just needs for the parties to believe we're better off with than without it. So that's the reason why I was worried about the status quo, and I do believe that's what's going to happen, because this empty shell remains empty, and it's great for Iran, it's great for Russia, it's okay for Europe, and it's okay for the West more broadly, US included. The only country for which it's not okay is Israel, obviously, but they don't get too
and I will borrow a very familiar Israeli phrase in that sense, in a different context: managing the conflict, right? Managing the conflict. It's an empty shell institution here. Richard Goldberg, Amir Oren, Nathaniel Shiraki, thank you for a fascinating conversation there. Thank you. 2 minutes break, and we're back with more.